Hi, everyone. Welcome back to CAHS Career Prep, where we talk all about how to get you ready for a career in arts, humanities, and social sciences. I'm Nicole McDavid, and in today's episode, we will be talking all about office culture. And to discuss this topic, we have professional Grace Treutel here with us today. Thanks for coming, Grace.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thanks for walking over from your desk.
From that 2 feet away,
From
yes.
right over here. Yeah. Grace Treutel is the Director of People and Culture at Blue Summit Supplies and currently is working towards her master's in marriage and family therapy. Over a decade's experience in the professional realm has helped Grace understand her value as an organizer of people. I love that phrase, organizer of people. That's kind of like, I feel like that's my life a little bit.
Yeah,
Organizer
a lot
of people.
Of us, yeah.
Her excitement and curiosity for facilitating better communication in larger systems, be they families, couples, corporations, or organizations of any size, helps fuel better connected, more productive, and more fulfilled individuals and systems. It's so great to have you here. So excited to talk about office culture with you.
I feel like I got the most fun topic.
It is fun. I love talking about office culture in general. And I think I want to start out with, because we're going to go through the different questions that we have, but tell us a little bit more about your role as Director of People and Culture and kind of how you came to be within that role, because Blue Summit Supplies is a office supply company, and it might not be one that people traditionally think of having a Director of People and Culture. I think it's amazing that you all have this. So talk a little bit about what that role entails.
Yeah, so I feel like my job, it sort of organically came to be where I was in marketing. I have a background in marketing. I got my, and we'll talk about this, I know, at the end of the show, but I have a degree in English. So I always was into writing and just communication in general, but typically more marketing, writing, communication. And it just sort of developed at this company where it was like we'd have sort of, if there were interpersonal conflicts or two people maybe weren't communicating as well as they could, or somebody was frustrated with this department, or there was a lack of clarity, which happens a lot in corporations, talking about going into professionalism or just a more professional realm, you'll find that I think one of the biggest causes of frustration is a lack of clarity. And it just kind of organically happened that when these things would happen, people would be like, oh, go talk to Grace, or like, Grace will help. And because I've always liked this stuff, I've always really enjoyed, I mean, like part of it is a nosiness, like I want to know what's going on, but also I find it very fulfilling and very interesting to kind of help people work better together. And so it sort of slowly happened where it was like, okay, Grace is helping with interpersonal stuff. Also, I started to take more of a role in defining our culture. And I know we'll talk more about sort of the ins and outs and what makes a culture and what is a good culture. But one thing that we always said here, my boss and I, Owen, he's the CEO of the company, is that a lot of companies don't have an intentional culture. And if you don't create a culture, if you don't sit down and define what your culture is, your company is still going to have a culture. It just might not be what you want it to be because you didn't have the time, you didn't take the time to kind of define it. So because I was a copywriter and because I was so sort of passionate about the company and the people within it, I got to write our culture book. And so it was me working with Owen for the first iteration. And then I think he kind of realized, like, you care a lot about this. So why don't you kind of take it over? So for a while there, I was sort of straddling where I was manager of content and culture. So I was still doing like our blog, our videos, our social. I was doing all of our marketing content stuff, but I was sort of pulling in these pieces of like, defining our culture, what's the word I'm looking for when you execute something? Executing like culture initiatives and things. And then it just sort of became a full-time role because we realized that, I mean, and I could talk about this for hours, so I'm trying to keep it kind of succinct, but that if you have a fulfilled, happy kind of workforce, like if our team is enjoying their jobs, they're so much more productive for us, right? So it's a little selfish where it's like we want to make a lot of money at Blue Summit Supplies. We want to grow really big, and we can't do that without our team. But also the way that we get there is like we just got to make this a great place to work. And so I was lucky enough to where my boss kind of saw the value and the need, and he was like, "I want you to do this full time." So I became the director of culture first, and then it was people and culture because HR just kind of fit in with that. So now I manage the HR piece too.
Yeah, that's great. When someone is interviewing for a job, and I think this is one of the most difficult parts of that, and they're trying to figure out what the organization's culture is before they get into the actual job, how would they go about doing that? Like, what are some things that they could do kind of in research or investigative to kind of figure out what that culture is?
I love this question, and I think this is a great question that I think is a lot of people don't take the time to do, and it's not complicated. So if you're curious about, am I going to be a good fit for this culture? Are they going to be a good fit for me? Research, right? Go online, Google the company. And I know we're talking to Owen later about interviewing, so I don't want to steal his answers. Yeah. But you look up the company, learn as much as you can about it before you even go in, right? So I always tell when people are I've had a couple of friends interview at my company, and they're like, how do I look good in the interviews? And I'm like, go research Blue Summit Supplies. Look at our website, look at our blog, see kind of what we're about, who we are, read our story. Do that for any company that you're interviewing at. Also, Google them on things like the Better Business Bureau and Glassdoor. People leave reviews for companies, and you can actually get a pretty decent idea of, like, do people enjoy working here? And if not, why? I think we're all kind of familiar with the adage where it's like people are more likely to leave bad reviews than good reviews.
Right.
So I would say if you see that they have maybe 3 or 4 bad reviews, you don't have to automatically say it's a terrible culture, I don't want to work there. But that is good information. Now, if you see that they have 20 good reviews, that's a great indicator that it probably is a pretty good culture. So I would say do your sort of prep work before you go in and research as much as you can. Go on LinkedIn, see who works there. Do some serious sleuthing. That's what I always do. Is I get in there.
Oh yeah.
And then when you're interviewing, ask questions. I think that oftentimes we underestimate our ability as the interviewee to be able to ask questions. You're interviewing each other. Remember that. Yes, they're in the power position. They're the ones who are able to give you the job, but you're also somebody, you have some agency here. Make sure you ask good questions. And I would straight up ask the person who's interviewing you, do you like it here? What do you like about it here? What do you not like about it here? Those are completely appropriate questions to ask. I interview every person that we hire. I interview them specifically for culture. And I love when they ask me that question because I'm always very honest. I'll say, here's what I love. And I'll say, here's what I personally wish was different. I wish we had more of a flexible whatever schedule, or, I try to be as honest as I can because I feel like they're there being honest and open. I want to be honest and open. And so I feel like they tend to leave with a pretty good idea of who we are as a company.
And I think that's great. And I think it's good at a company when you have that sense of transparency as you're going in. And thinking about that when we talk about culture, and this is a really interesting question because I teach some different elements of culture when we talk about it in organizations in some of my teaching roles. And so one of the kind of common questions is, what's a good office culture? And maybe what is a bad office culture? Yeah. And how do you figure out what that is? Mm-hmm.
I think that is such a subjective question, and I don't want to cop out because I think that there are some hard and fast things. But I think if you think about who you are as an individual, so if you are somebody who, when I was a teenager, I was such a fan of movies where the main character was this high-powered woman in a pencil skirt, and she had shiny black shoes, and she'd go into her little cubicle and sit and work, and I was like, that's working. And now as an adult, I realize that's not the culture I want. So what I'm trying to say is that there are different kinds of cultures, and they're not always inherently bad or good. Maybe you want a culture that's more rigid. Maybe you want a 9 to 5 where it's expectations are very clear. Nothing is expected of you beyond your 9 to 5. You go and you do your work, you leave. There's a really tight sense of professionalism where people treat each other with respect, but there's not a ton of mingling and friendships in the office. It's work, right? That's not a bad culture. That's just a type of culture. Now, if you're like me, maybe that does not sound appealing to you. So I would say I don't want that office culture. I want a more laid back environment. I want somewhere where we are kind of friends. I hate the word family when people talk about companies. It's so cringy. So I wouldn't say that. If you find a company that's we treat you like family, it usually means we're going to overwork you and underpay you. So I would say, don't do that.
So be very cautious.
Be cautious of the word family. But I will say that the place I work right now, it's a very warm sort of familiar company where it does have some elements of we're like a family. But that's what I like for me. So I would say good and bad is kind of subjective. However, there are some things that I think are always red flags. Right. One of them I think is, undervaluing employees. I think is kind of a big red flag where it's somebody, they say things like, I think we've all seen, especially people who are applying for jobs now, maybe you're newer to the professional realm and you're seeing these entry-level jobs that are we require 6 years of experience. And it's not entry level, and that happens a lot. I also think that there's that's a very specific one, but anything that kind of indicates that we don't value you as a human being. Yeah. We just value you as an output machine, right? What can you do for us to flesh out our bottom line, line our pockets. And again, I don't think that making a profit is inherently a bad thing. Companies need to make money to exist.
Right.
But I think a negative office culture is one where people are devalued. I think it's one where there is not transparency, and that's really hard to suss out. when you're interviewing. So I want to say that, like,
Yes.
that's tricky to say. Like, if
Yeah.
you're in the interviewing stage and you're trying to figure out, like, does this office have a good or bad culture? I don't try to get it right 100% of the time, because a lot of times, like, they're selling themselves to you. You know, they're trying to put their
You're
best
going to
foot
see the
forward.
best.
Yeah, and a
Yeah.
lot of companies will have, like, great core values that they put up in a frame on the wall, and they sound wonderful, and it takes you 3 months of working there to realize, like, oh, they're just a picture on a wall. You don't actually live by these.
Yeah.
And that takes time. But I think that that's a big red flag, is like, if they're saying these are the things that we value and you're seeing firsthand this is not accurate, I think that's a red flag. So I do think that there are certain things that are always kind of indicative of a not good office culture, a bad office culture. But again, like, I think it is so subjective. That's kind of a cop out answer, but you know what I mean.
No, yeah, and I think that's a great idea to put forth, is that it is subjective, and it is very much going to depend on how you want to work and what environment you want to work in. And with those red flags, one of the things that I always tell students is look for the amount of employee turnovers.
Yes.
That is
yes.
so important in understanding. Now, you have to, again, it's subjective, because if you're in an industry that typically has employee turnover a lot, like restaurant industry, employee turnover,
sales always has high turnover.
Yeah. I mean, yeah. So you're going to have ones that, you know, there's a lot of high employee turnover. But if you're going to apply for a job, and this is a job that you know, maybe come to find out through maybe doing some of your research or in the interview process, that this is like the third or fourth time they've hired it in the past, like 2 years, that is potentially a red flag. You know, you want to kind of think about that. It's like, how often are they hiring people for this role, and how often are people leaving the role? Is it just because they're getting, you know, a better position or a better job? Do they promote really fast, so maybe it's a good thing? Or is it because they're getting burnt out? And so I think that's, you've got to kind of do your research. You're not always going to get it right.
And that's trial and error. And you can ask these questions. I think that sometimes it feels very daunting, especially when you're young and you're newer to all this. It's like, I don't want to be rude, I don't want to overstep. But if you ask, you know, your interviewer, like, hey, I've noticed that this position's been filled 4 times in the last 2 years. Can you tell me about that? That is a completely appropriate question to ask. Now, you might also learn about their office culture by how they react to that question, right? If they are affronted and they're defensive, or they're, you know, somehow indicate that you've asked an inappropriate question, like, okay, that tells you that they're not very transparent. You know, so I feel like getting a read on your interviewers as well is a great indicator of office culture.
Oh yeah, definitely. So when you're going into that first job, how do you kind of work to be a part of the office culture? I always feel like when you go into a job for the first time, and it's been a long time since I've gone into a job like that for the first time. But I, you know, remember that feeling of going into it where you're kind of like the kid in the lunchroom on the first day, and you don't know anybody, and you're like, hi, I'm here and I don't know what to do. So how would they kind of go about the process of maybe I don't want to say assimilating into the office culture.
Assimilating is a great word, yeah. Maybe that's a great word. No, I think the kid in the lunchroom comparison is really apt, right? Like, we're all human beings, and it doesn't really matter how old you get or how like experienced you are. Going into a new environment is always daunting.
Yeah.
Especially one that you don't know what to expect. It's always that fear of the unknown, where it's like, I don't know how to dress, right? That's a big one. Where I just think that the best sort of thing that you can do to sort of smoothly slide into an office culture and fit in, right, for lack of better phrasing, is to fit in, is to just sort of start like overly professional. So maybe on the first day you go into and I've done this at every new job I've had. It's like, okay, I mean, you see I'm wearing a jumpsuit today. Like, it fades with time, but it's like, I'll start by wearing like a very professional outfit. I probably have heels on. I probably have like a little blazer on.
Yeah.
I go in the first day, I look what everyone else is wearing and doing. And then the first week, it's like, okay, now I'm looking at what everyone else does for lunch. Like, I'm kind of learning the office culture the first week or two, and I err on the side of being like overly professional, because what you don't want to do, I think it's way more sort of like, I don't say embarrassing, but like traumatizing to go in like a jeans and a t-shirt and everyone else is in slacks and a button down. Like, that's
right.
Don't do that. That's so much worse.
Yeah.
I feel like that's harder to recover from, because talk about first impressions, right? So if your first impression that you make with the company and that, you know, they sort of have of you is, okay, you know, Grace is professional, she's got it together. And then over time you slide into wearing your orange jumpsuit on Fridays. Like, that sounds like you're going to prison. When I say orange jumpsuit, I mean like a cool girl denim one. But no, I think that just learning it through, it's like anything else, learn it through observation.
Yep.
And be a team player. I mean, that's just kind of a soft skill that you should hone anyway as a professional, is being a team player. You might find that certain elements of the office culture they're not your favorite, right? If it's across the board you don't like it, then we can have a conversation. But if it's like, oh, the office goes really quiet from the hours of 11 to 1 because everyone's at lunch, and I don't love that because I'm here by myself and I don't really want to go to lunch. Like, I've had this conversation with employees before where it's like, what do I do during lunchtime? And I'm like, that's a you question. Like, you have to learn it over time, over exposure.
Yeah.
So I wouldn't sweat too much if you're a younger professional and you're going into a new workplace and you're like, I don't know what to expect. I wouldn't stress about it too much. I know that's hard. That's easier said than done, but you'll get it, right? Just give yourself some time, maybe over prepare a little bit, and then by the end of the second week, I bet you'll be like, I know what's expected of me, at least as far as like surface level etiquette and behaviors, and deeper stuff will come out in time.
Yeah, I think that's great. And you kind of hit on something in part of your discussion where you were talking about, like, if you're in that office culture and you're doing that observation and maybe there are some things that are going on that you are maybe not as okay with. And I always think of, cause in my mind, I always think of like gossip in the office, right? So if you go into, that office setting and there seems to be people that are like gossiping or maybe, doing things that you think, gosh, I don't feel comfortable with this. It's not something that's like super, high level, like needs to be reported,
right? But
it's something that you think, maybe this needs to change. How might someone go about doing that? I have an idea. I have what I do, and I'll share that, but I'd love to hear what your thoughts are on that.
Man, I'm gonna pull out like the cheesiest expression, but I feel like it's very much like, be the change you want to see in the world, right?
Yeah.
Like, I think that if you are somewhere where maybe it seemed really good on paper, you still like the job, but there is some like kind of office politic-y, gossipy, cliquey stuff going on. In every job I've ever had, like, I just don't engage. Yeah. And after a while, and there's a way to do it not rudely, right? Like, I mean, we all know, like, sort of, you do have to kind of play the game a bit where you don't want to sort of flat out be like, hey, that's wrong, and then you're making you're making your life harder. And especially if you're coming to a company where it's like, maybe they've been here for 10 years and it's been this way for 10 years, right? You're not going to come in on the first, second day, even second, third month and change everything. However, you can sort of be an example, and at the very least, over time, people will learn, like, well, don't come to Grace with that. She's not going to engage. Which somebody said to me once at an old job. I was leaving, and I said, I'd never heard about a couple things that happened. And she's like, oh, we knew not to talk to you about it. You weren't any fun. And I was like, that's all right. They knew not to gossip with me because I wasn't any fun. But another thing that I learned, and I love this, is that oftentimes we expect as people, it's like, okay, we want some change, right? I want to change myself, or I want to change my environment. And we have this idea of like, I want to have a 180-degree change. I want it to be different tomorrow or in a week. And the reality is that change happens in 2 degrees at a time. If you can envision how small is 2 degrees, right? If you want a 180-degree change, that's going to take 90 changes to make that happen. But that's the reality of human behavior, especially stuff that is so intrinsic as like gossiping or human communication, things that people have been doing for their entire lives. You're not going to come in and change them. Right. But you can do those little 2 degrees by sort of setting a good example. But I'm curious what you have to say.
So I love that, because that is making those like small changes and those intentional changes are so important, I think, especially when you think about office culture and changing it over time. It's not going to be something that, you're going to be able to go in and do wide sweeping changes and just expect it all to like work, right? And I'm going to go back to that in a minute, because we're going to talk a little bit about office building culture and that sort of thing. But what I tend to do, and I've kind of used this as a strategy when there is gossip, is I typically misdirect. And I don't mean misdirect like mislead people, but what I'll do is I'll kind of change the direction of the conversation. And so I steer it differently. And I typically will steer it towards like something of like myself or my experience, because then in that situation, then I'm talking about something having to do with me versus talking about others. And I'll kind of highlight something that then will kind of just reroute the conversation. And so that, for me, I'll be like, well, in the experience that I've had, this is like my experience here. And I'll say, oh, I had a really, and I'll just like take it, and so that kind of changes the situation, so that you're not getting kind of embedded within it. And I also have reached a point, especially in my career and where I've been working for a really long time, I'll just say no thanks.
Yeah.
I just tell people, I'll be like, I don't want to talk about this.
And I think that's important because they know you, right?
Yeah.
They know that you're not being like, they know who you are. And that does take time to build that sort of rapport with your colleagues.
Yes.
And they'll sort of laugh it off, right? Especially if you say it gently. So I feel like this can apply to so many things where if you see, and now there are always exceptions where like if something is happening that is an ethics violation or an integrity violation,
100%.
and it doesn't have to be like as extreme as we see in like training videos where they get ridiculous and cheesy. But like if something is going on where you're like, that makes me really uncomfortable, I think there's such a stigma against going to HR, but HR exists to help you out. So if there's something going on where you're like, man, this is really uncool, you can just go and talk to your HR person. Like that's my role. Is oftentimes I don't file stuff. Like I will if somebody's like, hey, I want to file a formal complaint, I'll say okay, and I'll that's a whole different process. But if someone's just coming to me and they're like, man, I don't know about this, or I want to talk to you about this, I'll just listen, and then at the end I'll say, do you want me to do something with this? And they'll be like, no. And I'm like, okay. And that was my function, was to just sort of listen and advise. So I would say, depending on your company, remember that HR usually is there to take care of you. Now, sometimes HR is Toby from The Office, and they're the worst. But
that is exactly what went into my redacted.
Yeah, redacted. Exactly. It can happen, but
but that is, and that is part of understanding the culture of the organization as a whole. So kind of with that in mind, and you talked about how you did this for Blue Summit Supplies. How do you go about, if that is particularly your role within the organization, how do you go about building an office culture, an organizational culture, if there isn't one that's already there? Because that sounds daunting, and it is needed, but that is very daunting. And when you started the process of building your culture, Blue Summit Supplies have been in existence, right? For a while?
Yeah, 2 years.
For 2 years.
So it was a baby, but it was maybe 2 or 3 years. That's a great question. And I wish I was like, here's how to do it, but I'm still learning. Yeah, exactly. I'm still doing it. I don't know. I feel like I've gotten really lucky with my role. And when I say lucky, I mean my boss, Owen, is he values this, right? So I think he's unique in that he's a very typical, you'll see in a different video, he's a very intense, sort of like a typical eccentric CEO. Like he just has a lot of thoughts, and he's very, I don't know, he's hard to deal with sometimes. He's a great guy, hard to deal with. But he's always really valued culture. He's always really understood the importance of culture, and defining culture and building culture. So I feel like step one is like, have a company and have a foundation of people that run the company that value it. Yeah. And if you don't have that, it's going to be tough. However, if you do have that, I feel like it's just a process of like, man, I read so much. I think it's people, right? Like the human element is such a variable, complicated element in business that I think we sometimes think about all the other hard parts of a job. And I'm not saying that one is harder than the other or more complicated than the other. I just feel like the human element is so unpredictable and so difficult to kind of corral. You can't make people do what you want them to do. You have to find ways to help them feel fulfilled, so that you have to find ways to get people to buy in. I think the best metaphor that I've ever heard was that my job and my function at this company, and if you're interested in going into this field at all, I would love to talk to you, because I think it's so rewarding, but it is hard, and I think that there's a lot of gray area around what it is, and this is the best definition I've ever heard, is that it's like, if this company is a long journey, right? Because that's the hope, is that we'll be in existence for a long time, is that we're getting on a road trip, and we're going to start in California, and we're going to road trip all the way to Florida. Right. So that's a long road trip. And everyone, when they get on the bus in California, is all jazzed and happy, right? Everyone's excited, everyone's got energy, everyone's happy to be there. By the time you get to Texas, everyone is tired. And half of the people want to get off the bus, and half of the people are fighting, and the other half are like, this is not what I was promised. I thought we'd be to Florida by now. And my job is to keep everyone excited on that bus. My job is to keep everybody like happy and rested and having what they need, and making sure that we're taking enough stops along the way, and making sure that, just everyone's sort of getting what they need, so that they stay with us. And not only do they stay with us, but they're enjoying it all the way to Florida. Or maybe not enjoying it, but finding fulfillment in it. And that is a very hard job.
Oh, yeah.
So when you say, how do you do it? I don't really have like a cut and dry answer. I feel like I read a lot of books. I feel like I do a lot of trial and error. I feel like I always make sure that I am valuing the individual as well as the whole. I think that sometimes we can sacrifice the importance of individual sort of feelings and needs in favor of like, well, what does the company need? What does the organization need? And I think that's such a slippery slope, and that's so dangerous to do, because the whole is made out of individuals. That if the stronger the individual, the stronger the whole. So I feel like that's part of it, and that just comes with a lot of a lot of talking and a lot of conversation. And I also, I mean, I'm lucky enough to be going to school. So I have an education that's kind of bolstering this, where I feel like I get to take pieces of that and apply them to like, how do we work better as an organization? So yeah, I wish there was like a better answer where it's like, here's how you do it. But I don't know. If you know how to do it, tell me. I would like to know.
No, I mean, I think that you're exactly right in the fact that you really have to be a consummate researcher.
Yes.
When you're building something from nothing, you are really taking, it's kind of like you're taking, sand and like, okay, I've got to build something out of this. How do I do that? And how do I make the sand into cement, and make that cement into bricks, and make those bricks into a house that we actually want to all live in?
And what's so hard, I think, is that you can't just Google how to make sand into bricks, because in this instance, with the human element, what worked in this company was not going to work at yours. Like, pieces of it will. You can learn and you can take. And I feel like what I'm doing is making this. It's like you're making a Frankenstein of like Frankenstein's monster. Excuse me. I know he's the doctor, but exactly we know. But you guys are educated. You understand. But no, I feel like that's what you're doing is you're piecing together things. So it's like it's a tricky job, because you can't just say, what's the formula to plug in here?
Right.
It's very much building. And even if you're not in a role that's like, oh, I'm in charge of culture, if you are somebody who's trying to, dovetail into an existing culture or change it for the better, that's going to be the same. It's like, how do you do that? You can read a bunch of books. I can recommend so many books. There's a lot of great books out there. But you can also just like talk to people and ask around and use Google, and there's all kinds of things.
Watch different TED Talks.
I do love a TED Talk.
I love a good TED Talk.
Yeah.
Listen to podcasts. I mean, I've done that so much. The role that I stepped into in 2022 as the career and internship coordinator for the College of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences, that position didn't exist before.
Yep.
And so I was like, okay, so what do y'all want me to do? And so it really was figuring out, what am I doing and how am I doing it? And I think that it definitely takes a certain personality type. I am both a fixer and a builder, and I feel like you're very much like that as well. And so that's kind of what I did. I started building stuff, and I would just take small things and I would see, like, does this work? And how does this work? And okay, let's try this and let's pull this in together. And it is very much a figuring out, how do we kind of put it all together to help to make our students, because what our goal is to make our students successful and have them have opportunities. But it is something definitely at the beginning that you're kind of like, oh, okay, how do we do this in a way that's going to be impactful, effective, and going to keep going?
I will say too that since you guys, I'm assuming, what grades, what ages are your students here?
I mean, they're going to be
grades. Like
what grades are you all?
Yeah, juniors, seniors.
I mean, yes, they'll be anyway. I mean, this, for the purpose of this particular video, they'll, like, it could be students who are in high school.
Okay, so
watching
so
everywhere up
young people.
Yeah.
So I will say one thing that I think is really important, and I had to learn the hard way, is when I graduated college, I was ready to change the world, and I was like, I can do all kinds of things, and I'm smart and I'm capable, and those things were true, and I'm sure they're true for y'all. But I did have to sort of get humbled a bit and learn, like, I'm 30 now, and I feel like I'm finally effective. Like, I do feel like there's a level of, especially when you're dealing with people in any capacity, right? There's a level of just sort of wisdom that you have to acquire, and I'm still, I think, on the young end for, like, being in a position of, like, I'm going to help you. Like, I mean, I have clients who are in their mid 40s, and they're kind of looking at me like, what are you going to tell me? You've barely lived life. So I would say, if you're young, and you're younger than me, so if you are out there and you're finding that maybe you're not as effective as you want to be, just give it time. Like, don't give up, don't get discouraged. It's a function of age and wisdom, and just keep plugging at it, and just keep learning and keep consuming and keep living your life. I mean, I think that's the biggest thing too, is like, just through existing and living in shared human spaces, I've learned so much about people. So I would say, have realistic expectations. You might not get a job like this right out of college, just purely because, through no fault of your own, you're just not there yet. But just keep building towards it. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And that is really the idea. And that's one of the things that we're really working on, helping students to understand that it is about your kind of life career path. You are in college for a short period of time. Your career is for a very long period of time. And, for some, students, they may retire at, 65. Some people may not, may continue to work into their 80s. I mean, depends on what you're doing and how much you want to keep doing it and how much you want to move to a condo at the beach. I mean,
Sure,
so you got to make your choices. But it is one of those things that it is seeing the long game versus the short game, very much so, in how you create that. So we've talked a little bit about kind of building the organizational culture and what you do when you come into the culture. Let's say, and I had this question because I thought about it yesterday and we talked about it a little bit. We talked about building your brand. Mm-hmm. And I feel like culture is part of this too. So if something happens in the organization, so crisis occurs, I teach crisis communication as a course, so I always think about this. And it's kind of along those lines. Yeah, along those lines. And so one of the things we talk about in that class is organizations that have had a crisis that has happened, and then they have to kind of recreate who they are as an organization in order to survive. So when that happens with an organization, how do they maybe culturally think about how they are going to move forward? And if you're a part of that organization, how do you make a decision of whether you're going to stay with that organization or maybe decide to leave? Are there certain indicators that they may give if kind of an overall crisis has happened?
So this is a big question. It's a great question. And it's a big question. So since I've been in this role, maybe just a little bit before, we've had a pandemic. We've had 2 rounds of layoffs that I think were related to the pandemic. Yeah. So we've had, talk about a crisis, there was like a global crisis and then we had some internal crises, right? Yeah. And I feel like we just were very intentional and we did our best to be very upfront. So for example, with the pandemic, it was like we were over communicating expectations constantly. Like, hey, look, we don't know what's going on. I mean, you guys remember the days of like, what is happening? Like, are we all gonna, if we go outside and breathe the air, are we just gonna drop dead on the sidewalk? Like, you didn't know. And so it was like
sourdough bread.
It was, let's all make bread and go on TikTok, even though you're way too old for TikTok. So I feel like that was kind of the MO there, was like, we're just gonna over communicate. We're gonna over communicate and be hyper clear. And I think that was the best move for us, at least culturally, because we didn't know and nobody knew, and we were trying to be honest about that, but also be like, hey, take care of yourself. Like, talking about focusing on the individual, I was able to understand, and so was my boss, was like, these were people whose lives and families were being affected. I mean, I was 27, 6 when the pandemic hit, and I was at home with 2 little kids who were suddenly like, no more school, no more daycare, and I was like, I don't know what to do. And so I got a lot of flexibility where it's like, hey, look, Grace is at home parenting, we're gonna, I don't know, it was a lot, right? So we just were over communicative and overly understanding, and I think that helped. Now, we had a layoff crisis. I think that the layoff crisis, both of them had more of an adverse impact on our culture, especially after the second one, right? Because the first one happened and it was like, look, we have overhired, and with, in light of certain, like the pandemic and our just sort of our financial situation, we have to shrink down. And I think people understood that. It was like, okay, sure, we got to let you go. And it was the same thing there, where we over communicated. We tried to be very clear in the aftermath of like, this is why this happened. Y'all's jobs are safe. We're weathering the storm. We're doing the best we can. Ask if you have any questions. It was just a lot of communication and a lot of transparency. Now, the second round of layoffs was harder because we had laid off maybe 8 months before, and the messaging after that was, we won't have to do this again. And so then after this time, and it was a different type of layoff, we had to close a piece of our business because it just wasn't working out. Like, they was just not making money. So we had to lay off the people who were supporting that specific business. And you can understand how the people who had been there for both, it was like, okay, one round of layoffs, they survived it. They were told it wasn't going to happen again. Another round, and we're saying the same thing. Trust has really been eroded, frankly. And I understand why. Like, I'm, as the director of culture, like, I understand why the culture has changed. And now a big part of my job is like, how do I rebuild that? And I know a big piece of that is time. Like, it's going to take time, right?
Definitely.
I can say until I'm blue in the face, like, it's not going to happen again. But even I am a little like, I mean, it could happen again. And I could be on the chopping block, right? So I know that if I'm feeling that way with all the information that I have, I know that surely that's happening with the rest of the company. So I think I kind of got straight off from the question. Am I?
No, I think that's good. So you were talking about how, like, at the company, when that happened, that immediately changed the office culture.
Yeah.
And then it's trying to figure out how do you go forward with that and get back that when you also have some insecurity about how the organization is going to go. Because with any organization and industry, unless you're working for, let's say, the government and your job is very secure, your job can change depending upon, you know, what is going on in the organization. And I mean, I am a child of a dad who worked for the government, but he worked on the industry side of it. And we lived, especially when I was younger, very much like a military style lifestyle. We lived from military base to military base and contract to contract. So, you know, wherever the contract was is where we went, because that was the way of being able to keep his job and not get laid off and not have, you know, a job and be able to support his family. And so that's something that, you know, I think a lot of people worry about going into organizations, but I do think that it is something that is very realistic, that can happen. But with the culture as a whole, kind of how do you feel going forward with the culture of the company? What are you all doing now that's maybe helping to build that back?
So I think, and I'll answer it kind of from both sides. So for me, what I'm trying to do as the person who's sort of tasked with overseeing, like, because I can't change the culture individually. It's made up of everybody, right? But I'm the one who I get to be. It's my whole job to make sure it's happening. And so I feel like what I'm doing is making sure that we over communicate and making sure that we are consistent and making sure that we are as transparent as is possible, right? Like there are some things that, you know, we can't share. Apparently we can't share everyone's salaries, but I do feel like there are a lot of things that I do push to share because I feel like we're all in this together, and we're a relatively small company still. I mean, we have 50 employees, not even. So we do have the luxury of being able to sort of communicate everything to everybody. And I think it's important, and so do my, you know, peers and my boss. We agree that it's important to, like, we're going to share our financial status. So every quarter we say, like, look, here's the balance sheet. Like, here's how we're doing financially, so that our team can see, okay, we are doing okay financially. And that's been a big piece of it, right? Is so that people know that this is not, if we, like, they're not in any jeopardy right now, and we don't foresee them being in any jeopardy, or the company being in jeopardy. Another thing that I think is so important, and this is really where a lot of my focus goes, when it comes to like coaching the directors or the leaders of my team, it's like we have to make sure that we are saying things that we, like, we're writing checks that we can cash, right? So don't overpromise, don't say things that you don't know for sure they're true, especially now. Like, it wasn't as intense before the second round of layoffs, and now it's like we have eroded their trust. That is our responsibility, and now we have to fix it, right? We have to repair it. So you have to be patient. You have to allow them to have their feelings. Like, they deserve to be frustrated. You know, they were kind of told, like, hey, look, you're safe, and then it was like, oops, surprise, and yes, you're still safe, but I understand why you don't trust that. And so I feel like we're leaving a lot of room for conversations to happen. One of the things that I do, one of my efforts at this company, is I do culture check-ins. So every other quarter, I'll meet with every single employee, and I just say, like, how are you feeling? Do you still like your job? Do you still trust the company? Do you not? Why not? And people are pretty candid about it. They'll be like, hey, look, honestly, like, I did a year ago and now I don't, or now I do less and here's why. And so I feel like listening is a big part of it. So if you're in a position where you are maybe in a managerial or a authority role, like, listen, take in the information they're giving you. And now if you're on the flip side of that coin, maybe you're not in a position of authority, but you're working for a company and you're like, I don't know if the culture has gotten negative, or it's gotten, kind of stressful here, it's changed in a way that I don't like. Hopefully, and this, I'm saying this hoping that you're in a situation where this is viable, articulate these feelings. Talk to your manager, you can always talk to HR, but I would recommend going to your manager first because you have a more intimate relationship with them, presumably. Sure. And say, like, hey, look, I'm really worried, or I'm really stressing because of this and this and this. And hopefully your manager will hear you and they'll be able to give you maybe more information, or say, hey, I didn't know that you thought that way, or hey, I didn't realize that, I'm going to go find information. So I would say, empower yourself to stand up for yourself or to advocate for yourself. That's totally appropriate. I've had people come to me and say, I almost said my office. I don't have an office. I have a desk in a big room with a bunch of other people. But they'll come up to my desk and they'll be like, hey, can I talk to you for a second? And then I'll be like, hey, look, what's really going on? And I'll be like, honestly, what we've told you really going on is what's really going on. But it's valuable for them to have that one-on-one face time to be like, tell me what's going on. So you can do that too. You could say, hey, look, can you just talk to me for a minute?
Yeah. And I think that's great. And it's great to find definitely, as you're working within an organization, find your people.
Yes.
It doesn't mean that they have to be your best friends. You know, you don't have to meet outside of the office, but you need to have people within the office that you can go and talk to and connect with and kind of get that information to help you feel confident in your job and where you're going with it at any particular point. And I think one of the most important things that you can do as you go through your career, especially when you are, you know, at that point that you're entering the workforce for the first time, you may be sometimes in an industry that you're not really sure how things are going to go, continue to network. I mean, it's so incredibly important. It doesn't mean that you're, you know, specifically looking for another job, but you need to continue to kind of keep yourself out there, keep yourself relevant within the field, talk to people, connect, because that means that if something does happen, it makes it a little bit easier to perhaps step into, you know, another role or find another place where you could potentially go if, you know, it doesn't work out, because that's just kind of the nature of how things are right now in the workforce. So it's something to be cognizant of.
Unprecedented amount of layoffs, and I want to say that too, just because you guys are so young, is that you are being handed kind of not like you're kind of getting shafted sorry like about like the world that you're going into. It's like you're in a post-pandemic, economy's not great world, where yes, there's a lot more remote ability, which is great, remote workability, but like everybody's vying for it, right? So the reality is like it's going to be, your experience will be different than mine was when I started 10 years ago when I started my career, and I think it's going to be a little more difficult, but I think networking is genius, and it's like the hard right thing to do, because man, I'm social and I don't like networking. I think it's the worst. There's something about it that smacks of like I don't know, like a level of sort of cheese to it. But you don't have to think of it as networking, right? You can think of it as like, I'm just making organic connections. And I would encourage you, like, make as many organic connections as you can in a professional capacity, because like Nicole was saying, they might save you one day. You know, you might be in a position where you're like, hey, look, I'm just looking. And they're like, oh, you know, I can recommend. So just network.
Definitely. Do you have any last advice you'd like to share with the students?
Oh, so many, but none that are appropriate for this show. I don't know. I just think
the after show.
Yeah, that's the after show. That's after dark. I don't know. I feel like my advice, if I could tell like baby me something, and when I say baby, I mean like young adult me, I would say like, don't stress so much about things. Like, I think that this is important, and this information is very important, but like the purpose of life is to find fulfillment and enjoyment in this life, and it is really important to, you know, have a good resume, interview well, take yourself seriously, dress professionally, look at the culture, do some research, but also like remember, like this is your life. You get to enjoy your life, so find a thing that you like doing, follow that path. Maybe pay your dues a little bit. We all had to do it. I worked some jobs that I didn't love, but I was always able to find a fun thing in those jobs. And I love what you said about find your people. Even if maybe you are an introverted person, or you're somebody who you're like, I don't really need people as much as others. And that might be true. I don't want to take that from you, but humans, we are herd mentality animals. We are pack creatures, and I think you will find that things will go a lot more smoothly if you find your people wherever you are.
Yeah, I think that's great. Well, thank you so much,
Thanks
Grace,
for having me.
for being here today to talk about office culture. And we would also like to thank Blue Summit Supplies for the wonderful facility that we are in and the resources to make this recording possible. A special thank you to our assistant media writer and researcher, Macy Morgan, video producer and editor, Jesse Hendricks, and producer, Grace Treutel. I'm your host, Nicole McDavid, and we'll see you next time for more CAHS Career Prep.